For 18 months, they watched him limp across the street. They laughed at the trembling old man who could barely hold his teacup. What they didn't know was that every stumble was rehearsed. Every weakness was a weapon. And by the time they realized the truth, it was already too late. This is the story of how one man became the perfect victim to catch the perfect predators. Before we begin, hit that like button, subscribe if you're new, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from right now. Let's see how far this story reaches. It all started on a foggy autumn evening in Portland, Oregon. Today I want to tell you a story so powerful it changed everything I thought I knew about justice. A story set in the heart of Portland, Oregon, where autumn rain falls like memories, and every shadow hides a truth waiting to be discovered. This was a city where survival depended not on strength alone, but on who could outthink destiny when worlds collided. It started with one moment, an old man standing alone on his balcony, a quiet scene that seemed ordinary, yet would soon unravel corruption no one dared to challenge. From the iron-laced balcony of his weathered Victorian home, Thomas Grant stood motionless, watching the shadowed corner of Ashford Lane through the slow drift of evening fog. His gloved fingers curled tightly around the cold railing as he shifted his weight with deliberate care, leaning hard on his right leg. Every movement was intentional, every stumble rehearsed for more than 18 months until pain itself looked natural. The children of the block whispered about him as the limping veteran. Shopkeepers offered strange smiles filled with pity. To the town, he was a fragile widower marked by war and loss. What none of them knew was that his limp was the most convincing lie Thomas Grant had ever built. The autumn air carried a sharp chill as he studied the figures below. Their attention lingered too long on his building now. He recognized the man at their center immediately. Marcus Stone. Even in the dim light, his swagger carried authority. He moved like someone accustomed to owning whatever he set his sights on. Thomas had been watching them for weeks, learning their roots, memorizing their habits, mapping their weaknesses. Tonight they had finally noticed him. Perfect timing. For nearly a year, the Riverside crew had ruled this neighborhood through fear. Bleeding, struggling homeowners drop on, leaning on elderly residents and tightening their grip through intimidation backed by politics. They operated freely while patrols vanished and complaints went unanswered. They believed themselves untouchable, but they had never crossed paths with someone like Thomas. Someone who understood that appearing broken could be the sharpest weapon of all. When Marcus gestured toward his home and muttered something that sent his men into laughter, Thomas allowed himself the faintest smile. They saw only what he allowed them to see. A wealthy widower, a ruined leg, a man alone inside a valuable property. An easy mark. What they could never imagine was that Thomas Grant had already dismantled 7 criminal operations across 3 states without firing a single bullet. He had done it through precision, through patience, through vulnerability worn like armor. His path began with grief, but grief had hardened into purpose. Tonight marked the beginning of the end for the Riverside crew. Let them mock his limp. By the time they understood the truth, escape would no longer be an option. "Mr. Grant, your evening tea." Thomas turned from the balcony to find Margaret Lawrence standing in the doorway, his housekeeper and the only soul in Riverside Heights who knew the truth. At 58, Maggie carried the calm of a woman who had witnessed enough of life's cruelty to remain steady in the face of anything. Even the moment she learned her employer's limp vanished completely whenever strangers were gone. "Perfect timing," Thomas said, accepting the cup without a tremor. "Marcus and his men are right on schedule." Maggie glanced toward the street, her expression tight with unease. "Are you certain this is wise? They've grown more violent these past months." Thomas lifted the porcelain cup, breathing in the sharp scent of bergamot, before answering. "Violence born from arrogance," he replied calmly. "They've never faced resistance. That makes them predictable." He nodded toward the street below. "Look how openly they watch the building. No caution, no discipline." Maggie leaned over the railing, lips pressed thin. "4 of them, and only you." She exhaled quietly. "Numbers were never your strongest talent." Thomas's eyes gleamed, not with fear but certainty. "You're forgetting the one factor that matters most," he said softly. "They believe I'm crippled, alone, helpless." He met Maggie's gaze. "Their belief is our greatest advantage." As the fog thickened, the pair retreated indoors. Thomas's third-floor residence filled the entire upper level of what had once belonged to one of Portland's founding families. Tall windows and ornate molding as whispered of old wealth slowly fading. A deliberate illusion crafted to support his story. Behind the 19th century elegance lay reinforcement steel, concealed locks, silent surveillance systems tracking every approach. What appeared to be aging furniture concealed compartments for tools, files, and defensive equipment. At his writing desk, Thomas withdrew a leather-bound journal from a false drawer and opened it carefully. He wrote with exacting precision. October 12, 2023. Surveillance initiated at approximately 7:20 p.m. 4 individuals observed. Marcus Stone, Ryan Kelly, Owen Fisher, and Blake Norton. Pattern consistent with prior operations. Estimated initial contact window, 48 to 72 hours. The page joined dozens before it, each one documenting the collapse of criminal groups that had mistaken weakness for safety. Thomas closed the journal and stepped before the tall mirror in his dressing room. With practiced movements, he adjusted the concealed brace beneath his trousers. When engaged, it produced his convincing limp. When released, it allowed full movement. The device had cost a fortune, custom built by a theatrical engineer who believed it destined for experimental stage work. But the transformation went far beyond machinery. Thomas had mastered the psychology too, the hesitation before stares, the tension in his shoulders, the subtle calculation in his eyes. Because deception, when done right, lives in the details. And tonight the trap had finally been sprung. From a concealed panel behind his wardrobe wall, Thomas withdrew a small silver locket. Inside rested a faded photograph of Sarah Grant, his wife. Her gaze was steady, her smile bright. Still the woman he remembered. Tucked behind the image lay a brittle newspaper clipping, its edges yellowed but its words painfully clear. Investigative journalist Sarah Grant killed in suspected accident. 3 years, he murmured. 7 taken down, and now the Riverside crew makes 8. His war had begun beside a grave soaked in rain, where grief hardened into resolve. Sarah had been tracing links between organized crime and city officials when her brake lines were cut without explanation. The investigation had ended far too quickly. Authorities ruled it mechanical failure, dismissing evidence that pointed elsewhere. But Thomas had kept her files, hidden from official orders demanding their surrender. And with his training in psychological operations, he began mapping the criminal structures most likely responsible. He did not seek revenge. He designed a method. He became the perfect victim. The approach devastated criminal groups that knew how to evade law enforcement but had no defense against a widower who looked fragile, wealthy, and alone. Mr. Grant, Maggie appeared at the doorway, interrupting his thoughts. I've prepared everything as you requested. Fresh surveillance batteries. Modified locks are set. Background files on our visitors are on your desk. Excellent, Thomas replied, returning the locket to its hiding place. He skimmed the documents Maggie had assembled. Interesting, he said quietly, especially regarding young Marcus Stone. Maggie nodded. His father once worked at Lockwood National Bank, the same institution that foreclosed on dozens of properties during the financial collapse. Thomas's brow lifted slightly, including several buildings now owned by shell companies tied to Councilman Drake. The very same. Thomas allowed himself a thin smile. Coincidences do love forming patterns. He crossed to the window and looked down at the street below. Beneath a flickering lamp stood Marcus Stone and his men, postures relaxed, confidence dripping from their stance. They were men who had never paid for their actions. They'll approach tomorrow, Thomas said calmly. Likely a staged mishap, an accidental meeting. And you'll be ready, Maggie replied. It wasn't a question. I've been ready since Sarah was buried. His voice carried no anger, only certainty. The Riverside crew is more than a street gang, Maggie. They're the visible arm of corruption reaching into this city's highest offices. Bringing them down isn't just about my wife, he turned slowly. It's about breaking a system that shields predators while abandoning ordinary people. Maggie inclined her head. I'll prepare your specialty blend for the morning. You'll need clarity. And please bring out the gray jacket, Thomas replied. The marine one. If we move to phase 2 sooner than expected, I may need the psychological advantage. As night settled over Riverside Heights, Thomas continued his preparations with unwavering precision. He studied each dossier carefully. Family ties, personal weaknesses, habits that could be exploited. He calibrated his brace to produce exactly the right degree of impairment, severe enough to appear limiting, subtle enough to avoid suspicion. Most important of all, he rehearsed his psychological posture. Marcus Stone had a documented pattern. He targeted those he believed helpless: older residents, the injured, the alone. His arrogance bordered on pathology. Men like him couldn't resist displaying power over the vulnerable. That impulse would destroy him. The grandfather clock chimed midnight. Tomorrow would begin a performance designed to collapse not only the Riverside crew, but the corruption sustaining them. This was justice Sarah would have recognized. Deliberate, structured, relentless. Thomas extinguished every lamp except one reading light by his chair. From the street, it would appear as nothing more than an aging veteran preparing for bed. From his darkened balcony, he confirmed two of Marcus's men had taken position in the alley opposite his home. The timeline was holding. By this hour tomorrow, Phase 1 would be in motion. Before returning to his bedroom, Thomas released the mechanism within his brace. The tension eased instantly, allowing him the rare luxury of natural movement. He stretched slowly in the privacy of his room, because predators never imagine what their prey becomes once the door closes. The movements Thomas performed each night were not meant for strength alone. They were corrective rituals. Precise exercises designed to counter the toll placed on his body by hours spent imitating injury. 18 months of deception demanded discipline, and he had learned that a lie carried too long could wound the truth beneath it. As he prepared for bed, his reflection caught his attention in the mirror. At 68, faint lines marked his face, not from age alone, but from sorrow. Grief lingered there, quiet and permanent. The loss of Sarah Grant had reshaped him far beyond his transformation from Marine officer into something far more dangerous. Once he had protected his country, now he ensured criminals faced consequences when the law refused to act. "They see the limp Sarah," he whispered into the stillness. "They never see me coming until it's already over." Morning arrived over Riverside Heights beneath the muted gold of an autumn sunrise. Thomas rose before his alarm, his mind already walking through every step of the day ahead. His dawn routine would have shocked anyone who believed him broken. Strength drills, flexibility work, combat patterns adapted from multiple disciplines. By the time Maggie arrived shortly after 7, Thomas had already become someone else again. The brace was locked into place. His posture shifted. A subtle tension entered his shoulders. Even his voice changed, slower, softer, marked by pauses that suggested effort rather than intention. The illusion of fragility settled over him like a second skin. "Your morning correspondence, Mr. Grant," Maggie said, playing her part flawlessly as she placed a tray on the table. On top rested an envelope bearing the official seal of the Portland Municipal Court. Another piece of theater in a carefully constructed life. "Thank you," Maggie, Thomas replied, his tone touched with the cultivated weakness the town had come to expect. "Has there been any unusual activity outside this morning?" "Yes," Maggie answered calmly. "One of those unpleasant young men from yesterday is observing the building from the cafe across the street. He's attempting to remain unnoticed and failing rather impressively." Thomas hid his smile behind the rim of his teacup. "Excellent," he said quietly. "I believe I'll walk to the market today. The fresh air may help my discomfort." "Shall I accompany you?" Maggie asked, the question carrying meaning beneath its politeness. "No, I think I must manage alone. Independence is important for my condition." The message was clear. Today would be their opening move. After breakfast, Thomas dressed with deliberate calculation. Clothing chosen not for comfort but suggestion. A soft gray sweater, trousers that restricted quick movement, and his old Marine jacket, worn, faded, but still carrying the insignia of the Corps. Beneath it all, the brace was tightened to its most restrictive setting, ensuring the pronounced limp Riverside Heights had come to recognize. At precisely 10:30, he stepped onto Ashford Lane. His cane tapped rhythmically against the stones as he moved with careful hesitation. Each step measured. Hidden within the polished shaft lay specialized tools, including a length of high-tensile wire capable of restraining a grown man, and a neural disruptor device disguised as the cane's ornate handle. From the corner of his eye, Thomas noted Owen Fisher rising from a cafe table, abandoning his half-finished coffee to follow at a cautious distance. To his trained eye, Owen's surveillance bordered on amateurish, too consistent in spacing, too intentional in avoiding eye contact. The market square buzzed with mid-morning life. Vendors called out prices. Shoppers drifted between stalls heavy with produce, bread, and handmade goods. Thomas angled toward a flower stand at the far edge, knowing the path would force him across the uneven stones surrounding the old fountain. A perfect place for coincidence. He sensed Marcus before he saw him. Stone timed his approach with predictable precision, striking just as Thomas reached the most treacherous stretch of ground. The collision was expertly staged, enough force to unbalance him while preserving the illusion of accident. "Oh my goodness," Marcus exclaimed, his concern polished and immediate as Thomas's cane clattered loudly to the stone. "I'm terribly sorry, sir." He caught Thomas's arms with firm hands. "Please, let me help you." Up close, Thomas saw what others missed. The cold evaluation behind his smile, measuring jewelry, posture, weakness. "Thank you," Thomas breathed, letting pain tremble through his voice. "I'm not as steady as I once was." "My name's Marcus," he said smoothly. "Marcus Stone at your service." He retrieved the cane with theatrical courtesy, placing himself close enough to test how much weight Thomas could bear. "You're too kind, Mr. Stone," Thomas replied softly. "I'm Thomas Grant." Marcus guided him toward a nearby bench overlooking the square. As they sat, Thomas noticed Owen repositioning nearby, pretending interest in a newspaper vendor while maintaining clear sight lines. Efficient but arrogant. "Do you live nearby, Mr. Grant?" Marcus asked, his voice warm with manufactured charm. "I don't believe we've met before." "Yes," Thomas replied gently. "The old Victorian on Ashford Lane. It's been my home nearly 20 years now." And just like that, the trap closed its first inch. "Though I don't venture out much anymore," Thomas continued, gesturing toward his leg with a faint apologetic smile. "My condition turns even simple errands into something of an ordeal." Marcus's face shifted instantly into practiced sympathy. "An injury?" he asked gently. "Yes," Thomas replied. "An accident 3 years ago. The doctors did what they could, but some damage doesn't fully heal." It was a partial truth, the strongest foundation for any believable lie. "My wife handled most practical matters," he continued. "Since her passing, I've had to learn independence, somewhat clumsily." The word widow landed exactly as intended. Thomas saw the flash in Marcus's eyes. Brief, predatory, quickly buried beneath concern. To his mind, the picture was perfect. A physically impaired man living alone, surrounded by valuable property. "I understand completely," Marcus said, lowering his voice. "My own father struggled terribly after my mother died. The connection was false but smoothly delivered, meant to establish familiarity while extracting information." Thomas responded with measured openness, offering just enough vulnerability to mark himself as ideal prey for the crew's usual pattern. "You're very kind to understand," he said. "So many young people have little patience for those of us who move more slowly through the world." He shifted with a soft wince. "I should head home soon. My housekeeper worries if I'm gone too long." "Allow me to walk you," Marcus offered immediately. "Right on cue. These streets can be dangerous, even for people without mobility troubles." As he helped Thomas stand, Marcus sent a subtle gesture toward Owen across the square, a signal to maintain observation. Phase 1 was complete. The walk back gave Marcus ample opportunity to assess him. His attentiveness appeared genuine, guiding Thomas carefully across uneven stone while quietly evaluating the building he lived in. "That's a beautiful property," Marcus remarked as the Victorian came into view. "These old places have real character, though I imagine upkeep must be difficult." "Very much so," Thomas replied, letting weariness color his voice. "The heating system in particular has been troublesome. Ever since Mr. Walsh retired, I've struggled to find reliable service." He sighed. "These newer companies charge outrageous prices for simple repairs." The bait settled perfectly into place. A wealthy widower burdened by property maintenance fit their pattern flawlessly. The Riverside crew always began with friendly assistance, discounted work, helpful gestures, before tightening the grip into dependency and control. At his doorstep, Thomas concluded the performance with flawless timing. "Mr. Stone, you've been so kind," he said. "I don't suppose you might know someone trustworthy who could look at my heating before winter sets in." "I'd gladly help. I'd be happy to assist," Marcus replied, his interest sharpening. "My associate Ryan Kelly specializes in heating systems. He could stop by to give an estimate. No charge, of course. We take care of our veterans. The mention of his Marine jacket, the psychological play. That would be wonderful, Thomas said, his gratitude carefully exaggerated. Perhaps tomorrow afternoon. I have a doctor's appointment in the morning. Tomorrow at 2 would be perfect. Marcus departed with courteous flair. Thomas allowed himself a single breath of grim satisfaction. They had swallowed the lure without hesitation. They saw only what he allowed them to see, a fragile veteran guarding valuable property with little protection. What they could not know was that they had just shaken hands with the architect of their collapse. Behind the limp and beneath the softness, Thomas Grant had activated the first movement of an operation designed to dismantle their enterprise piece by deliberate piece. Precisely at 2 the following afternoon, Marcus Stone returned to his home, this time accompanied by Ryan Kelly. Ryan's weathered face and calloused hands suggested years of honest labor, though Thomas's research revealed his true expertise lay in forced entry rather than furnace repair. The contrast between the men was intentional. Marcus arrived in a tailored charcoal suit, radiating respectability. Ryan wore stained work clothes, completing the illusion of legitimate service. "Mr. Grant," Marcus said warmly, "thank you for allowing us to address your heating concerns." Thomas greeted them at the door, his movements deliberately slowed. "This is Ryan," Marcus continued. "The specialist I mentioned." Ryan tipped his cap. "Pleasure, sir." And with that, the second phase began. Ryan gave a respectful nod as he stepped inside, though his eyes never truly rested. They moved quickly, measuring the width of doorways, lingering on the crystal chandelier, the antique console table, the framed artwork lining the walls. When his gaze brushed the security fixtures, it paused just long enough to register them before moving on with professional calculation. "The furnace is down in the basement," Thomas explained, motioning weakly toward the hall with a faint tremor in his hand. "I'm afraid I can't manage the stairs anymore. My housekeeper usually handles such things, but she's visiting her sister in Salem today." The implications settled immediately. He was alone. He could not access certain parts of his own home. Marcus's smile widened by the smallest degree. Ryan adjusted his tool belt with renewed purpose. "No need to trouble yourself, Mr. Grant," Marcus said smoothly. "Why don't you rest in the parlor while Ryan examines the heating system? These old Victorians are notorious for drafts. I'd be happy to keep you company while he works." The division unfolded exactly as Thomas had predicted. Ryan would map the house from below. Marcus would extract information above. "You're both very kind," he replied, allowing Marcus to assist him toward the parlor. His brace was locked into its most restrictive setting, forcing a convincing strain as he lowered himself into an antique wingback chair. Carefully positioned with his back angled away from the hidden camera concealed inside an ornamental wall sconce. As Ryan disappeared down the basement stairs, Marcus settled across from him, posture attentive, eyes quietly inventorying the room. "This home is remarkable," he said warmly. "You simply can't recreate craftsmanship like this today. My wife insisted on preserving the original character when we renovated." Thomas answered, carefully guiding the conversation where he wanted it to go. "She was quite particular, especially after inheriting her family's collection." Marcus's interest sharpened immediately. "A collection primarily documents and historical pieces," Thomas continued. "Items related to her work. Sarah was an investigative journalist. She had quite an eye for detail." The hook landed cleanly, but Marcus's reaction was different than expected. A subtle tightening of his shoulders, a faint narrowing of his eyes. "Sarah Grant," Marcus said quietly. "The journalist who died 3 years ago. I remember reading about that." "Yes," Thomas replied, allowing real emotion to surface. "The whole community felt that loss," Marcus continued, his voice carrying something Thomas couldn't quite place. Not just sympathy, something deeper. "You're very kind," Thomas said, his hand trembling as he reached for his teacup. "Though I sometimes wonder whether it truly was an accident. Sarah had been involved in some rather sensitive investigations before she died. The suggestion was deliberate, not accusation, just doubt. Knowledge without power. A widow who might know too much yet lack the means to act." Marcus recovered smoothly, reaching to steady the cup. "Such losses often leave one searching for meaning. I'm sure the authorities conducted a thorough investigation." "They said they did," Thomas replied softly, bitterness entering his voice. though certain details seemed overlooked. He sighed. But what can an old veteran with limited mobility do against a system eager to close uncomfortable cases? The silence that followed painted exactly the picture he intended. Then footsteps sounded on the stairs. Ryan returned, wiping grease from his hands that bore no actual dirt. "I've checked the furnace," he announced. "The situation's more complicated than we expected." Thomas's heart rate remained steady beneath his performance. "The circulation pump needs replacement," Ryan continued. "But I'm also concerned about potential gas line inconsistencies." The escalation came sooner than expected. "Gas line issues," Thomas whispered. "That sounds dangerous. Safety must come first," Marcus said smoothly. "Fortunately, we can address it immediately. Ryan can source replacement parts while my colleague Owen evaluates your electrical system." As if rehearsed footsteps echoed from upstairs. Thomas hadn't heard anyone enter. But Owen Fisher appeared in the doorway. Solid, quiet, eyes that calculated numbers. "I've detected irregular voltage at the main panel," Owen added gravely. With a structure this old that could present fire risks, the performance was flawless. Each concern reinforced the next. Danger layered upon danger, designed to overwhelm resistance and justify prolonged access. For most victims, this was where fear took control. Thomas allowed his voice to waver. "This is all rather overwhelming. I fear today has already exhausted me." He pressed a trembling hand to his chest. "Perhaps we should continue tomorrow when Maggie returns. She's handled these matters since my wife passed." The mention changed everything. Marcus exchanged nearly invisible glances with his men. A witness complicated timing. After a moment, he smiled. "Of course," he said graciously. "Your comfort is our priority." Behind the courtesy, Thomas could feel the recalibration. The Riverside crew had adjusted their strategy, and now they were closer than ever to making a mistake they could not undo. Still, Marcus said carefully, "Those gas line inconsistencies Ryan mentioned do concern me. Carbon monoxide has no smell at all. It's especially dangerous for someone in your condition." The emphasis was subtle but deliberate. He wasn't speaking about safety. He was applying pressure. By invoking Thomas's perceived fragility, he attempted to override the boundaries just established, reshaping concern into justification for intrusion. It was a familiar maneuver, one Thomas had cataloged across countless prior cases. "That's very thoughtful of you to worry," he replied softly, allowing uncertainty to tremble through his words. "Perhaps Ryan could at least stabilize the line before you leave. I'd sleep easier knowing it's secure." The concession was calculated. It appeared compliant while preserving his authority over the timeline, encouraging further action without surrendering control. At the same time, it allowed him to document precisely how they escalated once permission was partially granted. A sensible suggestion, Marcus agreed, nodding once toward Ryan. "We'll address the immediate safety issue today and return tomorrow for the full repairs." Then, as if struck by a helpful thought, his expression brightened. "In fact, I could stop by this evening, just briefly, to make sure everything's operating properly overnight." The request was significant. Evening access meant darkness, isolation, opportunity. Thomas had anticipated this move eventually, but not so early. The acceleration confirmed his growing suspicion. Pressure from above was compressing their usual schedule. "Oh, that really isn't necessary," he said gently. "I wouldn't want to inconvenience you." "It's no trouble at all," Marcus replied smoothly. "Community care is the foundation of our work." He paused. "I could even bring dinner. You mentioned meal preparation has been difficult lately." Thomas hadn't mentioned anything of the sort, but the invented familiarity served its purpose, establishing emotional obligation while reinforcing the narrative of helplessness. It was refined manipulation, layered and deliberate. "Well, if you truly don't mind," Thomas said at last, allowing a faint note of gratitude to surface. "Nothing heavy, please. My diet is rather restricted these days." Marcus's satisfaction flickered briefly behind his eyes. "7 then," he said. "That gives Ryan time to finish securing the line and prepare tomorrow's recommendations." As arrangements were made, Thomas observed with detached precision, Blake Norton had appeared at some point, methodically examining door frames and window casings, pretending to test for drafts while cataloging entry weaknesses. Owen had vanished upstairs again, his so-called electrical inspection serving as cover for a full sweep of private rooms. Ryan returned to the basement carrying equipment that to trained eyes contained far more than furnace tools. This was not opportunism. This was structure. By noon, the Riverside crew had completed their preliminary mapping of his home, establishing reasons for future access while collecting a comprehensive profile of security layout and perceived assets. Marcus presented him with initial documentation, dense with technical phrasing and intentionally vague cost projections. "I'll prepare a clearer proposal tomorrow," he said as the team gathered their tools. "This evening we can discuss payment arrangements better suited to your fixed income." The seed was planted, debt before transfer, dependency before surrender. "You've all been incredibly kind," Thomas said, escorting them toward the door with movements visibly strained after the prolonged performance. "I don't know what I would have done without you." At the threshold, Marcus lingered. "7," he said warmly. "Don't trouble yourself with preparations. I'll bring everything we need." The meaning beneath the words did not escape him. "I'll look forward to it," Thomas replied softly. "Evenings can feel rather lonely." Once the van disappeared down the street, Thomas maintained his limp for exactly 12 minutes. The standard post-departure observation window documented in prior Riverside crew operations. Only then did he straighten. The brace disengaged with a quiet release. "System," he said calmly, moving behind the sliding shelves of the library. "Open, secure channel to Margaret Lawrence." The screen lit instantly. "I've been watching the feeds," Maggie said. "They're moving fast." "Much faster than normal," Thomas confirmed. Scrolling through surveillance captured throughout the house. Pressure from Drake. Permit filings show the development groundbreaking next month. They need full acquisition immediately. "And Marcus returning alone tonight?" Maggie asked. "That's deviation." "Opportunity," Thomas corrected. Enlarging footage of Ryan installing micro devices in the basement. "Their surveillance hardware is standard commercial grade. Our countermeasures are feeding altered audio and visual loops. Exactly what they expect to see." He paused. "The real purpose of tonight's visit isn't maintenance." "What is it?" Maggie asked. Thomas's voice remained calm. "Initial intimidation phase. And this time they were walking straight into it. He'll apply pressure without making it sound like a threat," Thomas said. "He'll test my reactions, measure how much resistance I show, then adjust his next move accordingly." Maggie's expression remained tight with concern. "You're allowing the intimidation to happen face-to-face instead of documenting it remotely. That's a serious deviation from your usual protocol." "It has to be this way," Thomas replied, shifting a second display toward her. Financial charts filled the screen. Layered shell companies. Offshore transfers. Property funnels. In previous cases, anonymous holdings protected Drake from direct exposure. "I need Marcus to verbalize the connection. I need him to tie my property to the development project while issuing actionable pressure. And if he escalates beyond pressure," Maggie pressed. "Blake has turned violent before when resistance appeared." "He won't be there tonight," Thomas answered with quiet certainty. "Marcus handles the first intimidation phase himself. He maintains the respectable businessman role until debt leverage fails. Physical enforcement comes later." Their discussion continued for several minutes. Mapping escalation thresholds. Reviewing behavioral patterns. Refining Thomas's emotional responses for maximum psychological yield. By the time they finished, his strategy was precise. He would draw Marcus forward just enough. "I'll return before dawn," Maggie said finally. "If anything deviates beyond projection, activate emergency protocol only as a last measure," Thomas replied. "Without a direct link between Drake and the Riverside crew, we dismantle a team but leave the machine intact." After the call ended, Thomas moved into his training room. For 30 minutes, he worked through controlled conditioning drills, counteracting muscle strain caused by hours spent in the brace. The device produced genuine fatigue when worn too long. Without disciplined recovery, it could compromise mobility when he needed it most. Afterward, he reviewed the day's intelligence. Ryan's furnace inspection had doubled as a full structural analysis of the basement. Owen's electrical review provided cover to catalog valuables throughout the upper floor. Blake's draft inspection had quietly identified access vulnerabilities. Most revealing of all, Marcus had photographed documents in his study: property taxes, insurance policies, ownership history. The pattern was unmistakable. Information first, debt second, transfer last. Predictable, Thomas murmured, watching the footage, and therefore controllable. The afternoon was spent reshaping his environment. The dining area reflected subtle decline, mismatched place settings, aging linens, a suggestion of austerity rather than poverty. Specialized recording devices were concealed within decorative fixtures, invisible even to experienced sweeps. His physical preparation followed. Cosmetics deepened shadows beneath his eyes, softened muscle tone, enhanced the impression of lingering pain. Tonight required balance, enough fragility to invite confidence, enough awareness to extract truth. At 6:45, he reactivated the brace. Fatigue settled naturally into his posture. He seated himself in the parlor with a photo album resting across his lap, images of a life that appeared finished rather than interrupted. The doorbell rang at precisely 7. Through the hidden monitor, Thomas observed Marcus Stone standing alone on his porch. He held a bag from one of Portland's finer restaurants. Intentional, calculated, comforting. He didn't look like a predator. That was the point. Drawing a slow breath, Thomas rose with visible effort, reached for his cane. Tonight would determine whether the Riverside crew advanced directly to threats or continued the illusion of benevolence while tightening financial control. Either path would yield evidence, but open intimidation would accelerate everything. He opened the door. Mr. Grant, Marcus said warmly, "I hope I'm not disturbing your evening." His gaze lingered on the carefully enhanced exhaustion. "You look worn down. Perhaps I should come another night." "Nonsense," Thomas replied gently. "I was only looking through old photographs. Your visit is a welcome distraction." Marcus entered with easy confidence, the scent of warm food following him inside. "Ryan confirmed the gas line is stable for tonight," he said, as Thomas guided him toward the dining room at a deliberate pace. "Tomorrow's work will require additional equipment, of course." "I'm grateful," Thomas said softly, "though I can't help worrying about the Bostihum. This house seems determined to drain what little remains of my pension." Marcus placed the containers neatly on the table. Then his tone shifted. Barely perceptible, but unmistakable. "Financial concerns," he said, meeting Thomas's eyes, "are exactly what I hoped we could talk about this evening, Mr. Grant." And with that, the trap tightened another inch. The grandfather clock in the hall began its slow march toward 9. "I believe there may be a way out of this situation for you." The shift came smoothly, too smoothly. Marcus positioned himself as the rescuer before revealing the true shape of his help. Thomas recognized the maneuver instantly. Marcus hadn't even waited for them to begin eating. That deviation mattered. In every documented operation of the Riverside crew, the solution phase came later, after comfort, after trust. This early pivot signaled urgency beyond their normal rhythm. "A solution would be a blessing," Thomas said softly, letting fragile hope rise into his voice. As he spoke, his fingers brushed the edge of his collar, activating concealed recording nodes embedded in the fabric. "Though I fear my choices aren't what they once were." Marcus busied himself arranging the food containers with excessive care, deliberately slowing the conversation to keep control of its tempo. "I happen to notice some property paperwork in your study," he said casually. "This part of Riverside Heights has become quite valuable." "Has it?" Thomas replied, sounding genuinely surprised. "I rarely pay attention to such things since Sarah passed." He sighed faintly. "The taxes have gone up, yes, but I assumed that was simply the city trying to plug another budget hole." Marcus shook his head gently, the tone shifting into practiced instruction. "It's far more than that. This district has been flagged for premium redevelopment. Properties along this corridor are now selling at several times their assessed value." "Selling," Thomas repeated, confusion deliberately crossing his face. "But I have no intention of selling. This house holds everything I shared with Sarah." The resistance was intentional. He needed Marcus to push harder. For a fraction of a second, irritation flashed across Marcus's expression, then vanished beneath sympathy. "Sentiment is understandable, Mr. Grant," he said, "but practicality must sometimes lead." He leaned forward subtly, closing the distance. "The City Council recently approved updated historical compliance standards. Homes of this age now require extensive modernization. Fire systems, Structural reinforcement, accessibility compliance. His voice lowered. The cost can reach hundreds of thousands. The threat was textbook. Thomas had recorded identical language in 3 prior Riverside crew cases. Manufactured regulation used to create impossible financial pressure. That can't be right, he protested, allowing distress to surface. I could never afford that. Marcus's face softened, but his eyes sharpened. That's exactly why I asked to speak privately. Certain property owners have been granted alternatives. Alternatives, Thomas asked, exhaustion and fragile hope blending perfectly. What kind of alternatives, Stonegate Development Group? Marcus said. Reaching into his jacket, a folder landed on the table with ceremonial weight. They're prepared to purchase select homes at favorable rates, all compliance issues handled, relocation assistance included. The name mattered. Thomas kept his expression blank as his devices captured everything. I don't understand, he murmured, studying the pages as if overwhelmed. The numbers look generous. But where would I go? I've lived here most of my adult life. Marcus didn't hesitate. The response was rehearsed. The consortium partners with assisted living communities tailored for residents with mobility concerns. Full services, no maintenance, medical support available. It sounds very efficient, Thomas said slowly, but terribly sudden. I'd need time. The faintest tightening crossed Marcus's jaw. Time is exactly what you don't have. Thomas's gaze lifted. What do you mean beginning next month enforcement begins? Daily penalties will apply to non-compliant properties. Daily penalties, Thomas whispered. On my income, that would ruin me, which is why immediate action is strongly advised. Marcus pressed. The offer expires by week's end. Once enforcement begins, property values will collapse. The false deadline landed as intended. Manufactured urgency designed to prevent outside consultation. Thomas's hands trembled as he turned the pages. This is all so much, he said quietly. Sarah always handled these matters. She believed this home's historical designation protected it. That name changed everything. Marcus's posture stiffened. Those protections no longer apply, he replied too quickly. Councilman Drake was explicit. Redevelopment compliance overrides all prior exemptions. There it was, the connection. Thomas looked up slowly. Councilman Drake, he repeated. Sarah mentioned him often before her accident. She was investigating zoning irregularities. For the briefest moment, Marcus froze. Then he reached for the food containers. Regulatory matters can sound frightening, he said abruptly. Let's eat. These discussions go better with a full stomach. The deflection told Thomas everything. The name had landed too close to the truth. And somewhere beneath the polished smile, Marcus Stone now realized this widow was not as harmless as he appeared. Thomas allowed the conversation to drift, sustaining his fragile facade while planting just enough resistance to force escalation. As the meal progressed, Marcus's posture shifted. The warmth thinned. Persuasion gave way to something darker. He began referencing unfortunate events. Homes lost to mysterious electrical failures. Burst pipes flooding entire floors. Break-ins that somehow targeted only uncooperative residents. This neighborhood is changing fast, he said with feigned concern. A man, in your condition, living alone in Riverside Heights. That creates exposure. Thomas lifted his eyes slowly. Are you saying I'm not safe in my own home? Marcus's reply struck the perfect balance between menace and deniability. I'm only saying transitional districts attract opportunity seekers. Our organization can extend protective services, but only to participating residents. The word protection completed the pattern. Thomas had documented every stage before. Help, fear, urgency, then control. Each step tied cleanly to Stonegate Development and Drake. I'll need to speak with my attorney, he said quietly, before signing anything. The temperature in the room changed. Marcus's pleasant expression tightened. That would be ill-advised, Mr. Grant, he said. Involving outsiders complicates matters. And time truly isn't on your side. I still must. Thomas insisted. Sarah always said never to sign without review. That was the moment. When pressure failed, Marcus abandoned subtlety. His voice lost its warmth entirely. The consortium already owns every other property on this block. Construction begins next month. Regardless of your decision, he leaned forward. Those who refuse cooperation experience difficulties, electrical fires, structural collapses, even injuries. Silence settled thick between them. The process can be dangerous around occupied buildings, Marcus added coldly. The threat was no longer implied. It was spoken. Thomas's devices captured every syllable. "Are you threatening me, Mr. Stone?" he asked, his voice trembling. "I'm offering you the only survivable option," Marcus replied. "You either benefit or you suffer." At that precise moment, the grandfather clock in the hall struck 9. Once, twice, 9 times. Thomas's expression changed, not fear. Clarity. "Thank you," he said calmly, "for stating that so clearly." He rose from his chair, straight, strong. The limp vanished as he disengaged the internal brace with practiced ease. The audible click echoed in the sudden stillness. Marcus stumbled backward, his chair scraping against hardwood. "What the hell is this?" Justice Thomas replied evenly. "For Sarah Grant and 7 others who died after refusing your operation." The front door opened with precision timing. Detective Nathan Cross entered with 4 officers. Behind them, tactical vests visible, weapons drawn but lowered. From the kitchen, Maggie stepped forward, her eyes hard with satisfaction, no longer playing the concerned housekeeper. Her posture military, controlled. "Marcus Stone," Nathan announced, his voice carrying the weight of federal authority. "You are under arrest for criminal intimidation, conspiracy to commit murder, fraud, and racketeering." He turned slightly. "Your associates were taken into custody 20 minutes ago." As handcuffs closed around his wrists, Marcus stared at Thomas in disbelief. "The weakness," he whispered. "The tremor. All fabricated." "Yes," Thomas said calmly. "My work focuses on predatory psychology, how criminals hunt those they believe defenseless." Understanding finally struck Marcus. "You were hunting us. Confidence becomes blindness," Thomas replied. "And blind men always fall." 3 months later, Thomas stood on the courthouse steps as cameras swarmed. Inside, Richard Drake faced indictment. Riverside Heights no longer belonged to corruption. Thomas wore no brace now, no disguise. Just a quiet strength as the system he dismantled collapsed behind him. Brick by brick, lie by lie. Under the same sun that once watched predators circle a man they believed could not fight back, and never imagined he already had. "Mr. Grant," he turned to see Nathan approaching across the courthouse steps. His expression carried the familiar mix that had defined their partnership from the beginning. Professional respect tempered by quiet concern. "The prosecutor's office finalized your testimony," Nathan said in a lowered voice. "You'll be on the stand next week. The connections between Drake Stonegate and the Riverside crew are now firmly established. Your recordings form the backbone of the indictment." "And the historical protections?" Thomas asked. His focus had never stopped at individual arrests. He always looked for the structure beneath the crime. "Approved yesterday," Nathan replied. "The Heritage Commission fast-tracked the review. The entire Ashford Lane corridor now carries protected status. No demolition, no redevelopment, no loopholes." Thomas allowed himself a faint smile. Not triumph, relief. This was more than justice for Sarah. It was a wall built of law instead of grief against the machinery that had crushed her. "The consortium's investors are panicking," Nathan continued. "Several are trying to trade testimony for immunity. They're scrambling to cut ties to Drake. Financial conspirators turning on political facilitators," Thomas said quietly. "Exactly the fracture we anticipated." Nathan nodded. "We wouldn't have reached it without your operation." Then after a pause, he added gently, "Though I still believe there were safer ways to get here." The old difference between them surfaced again. Nathan's faith in institutional process. Thomas's belief that predators could only be exposed by walking directly into their reach. Before either could speak further, Maggie approached from the direction of the prosecutor's wing, a thin folder held tight against her side. Her stride carried urgency. "They found it," she said without preamble, handing the folder to Thomas. "Archived correspondence hidden under a subsidiary's records." Thomas opened it carefully. Inside were printed emails dated 3 years earlier. Direct instructions from Drake, orders to resolve the Grant complication before Sarah could file zoning corruption charges. The room around him seemed to fall away. "This completes the chain," Thomas said evenly. Direct coordination between Drake and Stonegate, and motive tied to Sarah's investigation. The district attorney is adding conspiracy to commit murder, Maggie said softly. They'll announce it today. For a moment, the three of them stood in silence. An operation born beside a rain-soaked grave had reached its end, not in vengeance, but in exposure. What happens now? Nathan finally asked. The question was larger than the case. For 3 years, justice for Sarah had defined Thomas's existence. Grief had sharpened into purpose, purpose into method, method into precision. Now the mission was complete. He answered without hesitation. The Hargrove case in Denver County shows identical pressure patterns, he said. Elderly residents, property intimidation, municipal cooperation with private enforcement contractors tied to prior criminal records. Nathan exhaled slowly. You're not stopping. No, Thomas replied. Predatory systems depend on perceived weakness, age, isolation, disability. Victims rarely report. When they do, they aren't believed. Traditional enforcement can't always penetrate that silence. So you'll keep becoming the target, Maggie said quietly. So others don't have to. With variation, Thomas answered. The limping veteran is finished. That identity is burned. Future operations will require different vulnerabilities, different masks. The courthouse doors opened. Reporters shifted into position. Inside, prosecutors prepared to announce the expanded indictment of Richard Drake. Outside, the narrative would belong to officials, departments, and press statements. Thomas preferred it that way. Your testimony next week ends your formal role, Nathan said, watching him carefully. After that, you could consult officially. Behavioral analysis, strategic profiling. You'd have protection. The offer wasn't new. And as always, Thomas didn't answer right away. Because some wars could not be fought from behind a desk. And some predators could only be caught when they believed the prey was already broken. Some predators exist beyond the reach of ordinary law, Thomas replied quietly. His refusal softened by sincere respect for Nathan's concern. Effectiveness sometimes requires standing where the system cannot. Before Nathan could answer, raised voices rippled through the courthouse entrance. Richard Drake had arrived, surrounded by attorneys, microphones, flashing cameras. Yet the man who once ruled Riverside Heights now looked hollow. His shoulders curved inward. His eyes darted. Power had abandoned him, leaving only reflexive fear behind. Thomas watched with the trained perception earned through years studying hunters who believed themselves untouchable. Collapse followed patterns. Dominant men once stripped of immunity often shrank faster than their victims ever imagined. He doesn't even recognize you, Maggie murmured, as Drake passed within yards of them. His gaze sliding past Thomas without pause. He never truly saw me, Thomas replied. Only what I allowed him to see. A trembling widow, a crooked step, a man alone, never the danger. As the press conference began, the three moved across the street into the small park shaded by autumn trees. From the courthouse steps, the prosecutor's amplified voice carried clearly. Expanded charges linking Richard Drake directly to the death of investigative journalist Sarah Grant. Nathan studied Thomas's face. Justice, he said quietly. Partial justice, Thomas corrected, calmly. Drake will answer for his crimes. But the structures that enabled him remain intact. His words reflected how far his purpose had evolved. Sarah's death had ignited his transformation, but it no longer defined his limits. Predatory systems persist, he continued. They simply adapt. The vulnerable remain targeted. His gaze drifted beyond the courthouse. The Denver cases show a different model. Developers exploiting medical debt rather than regulatory pressure. Seniors buried under treatment costs become compliant far more quickly. Maggie and Nathan exchanged a knowing glance. Once Thomas began mapping patterns, there was no stopping him. At least allow additional support, Nathan urged. Surveillance coordination, emergency protocols, evidence control. Operating outside the system complicates prosecution. It's precisely why it works, Thomas replied evenly. Predators exploit what law cannot reach. The philosophical divide remained unchanged. Law against shadow, structure against infiltration. From the courthouse steps, District Attorney Harrington briefly glanced toward them. He's watching, Maggie noted. He suspects, Thomas replied, but cannot trace what lies between formal investigation and lived exposure. The press conference concluded with promises of further indictments. Corruption spreading outward beyond Drake into officials tied to Stonegate. The dismantling had begun. As they prepared to part, Nathan spoke one final time. The Limp may have been an illusion, he said, but its impact reshaped Riverside Heights. Whatever your methods, the results speak. Thomas inclined his head slightly. Different weaknesses attract different predators, he replied. Those who mock vulnerability reveal the blind spots that destroy them. 3 days later, the Victorian townhouse on Ashford Lane stood empty. Neighbors whispered that the disabled veteran had moved into assisted living after the strain of the trial. The story spread easily, carefully planted. In truth, Thomas Grant had already vanished. A new identity had taken form in Denver. Different papers, different scars, different weakness. This time he would appear as a recently divorced man drowning in medical debt, struggling with fading memory and unpaid hospital notices. The limping veteran had served his purpose. New predators required new bait. What began as vengeance for Sarah had evolved into something far greater. A quiet war waged for those truly defenseless. Soon developers would sneer at his confusion, exploit his fabricated desperation, push too far, and only then would they realize too late that vulnerability, when wielded with precision, was the deadliest weapon of all. In Riverside Heights, justice had worn the mask of a broken veteran. In Denver, it would arrive wearing something else entirely. Different disguise, same ending, because those who prey on weakness never see the blade until it's already drawn. But Denver would prove more complex than Thomas anticipated, not because the predators were smarter, but because the system supporting them ran deeper than anything he had encountered before. 1 week after Drake's indictment, Thomas sat in a safe house on the outskirts of Denver. Maggie across from him. Surveillance feeds running on multiple screens. They were reviewing intelligence that Nathan had forwarded through encrypted channels. Mountain Ridge Properties, Maggie said, reading from the file. Same pattern as Stonegate. But the parent company is different. Cascade Holdings. Thomas leaned forward, his eyes narrowing at the name. Run a full financial trace. I want to know who owns Cascade. Already did, Maggie replied, her voice carrying an edge he rarely heard. It gets complicated. 7 shell companies deep. Offshore trusts. The actual ownership is buried in the Cayman Islands. Thomas's jaw tightened. That's not coincidence. That's expertise, Nathan Thomas said slowly. Run a financial trace between Cascade Holdings and Stonegate Development. Already did, Nathan replied through the secure line. There's a connection, 3 shell companies deep. Stonegate received seed funding from a Cascade subsidiary in 2019. Thomas exhaled slowly. Drake wasn't just local corruption. He was a franchise. Hartman's testing ground. On the surveillance feed, images appeared. Properties across 12 states. On the surveillance feed, images appeared. Properties across 12 states, and all connected to subsidiaries of Cascade Holdings, all using the same playbook. Target vulnerable populations. Apply regulatory pressure. Force sales below market value. How many victims, Thomas asked. Conservative estimate, Maggie replied. 2,000 over 8 years. 24 deaths ruled accidental, all tied to refusals to sell. The scope staggered him. Drake had been terrible, but this was systematic, industrial. Nathan's voice crackled through the secure line. Major Grant, you seeing this? I'm seeing it, Thomas replied. Who runs Cascade? That's the problem, Nathan said. CEO is listed as Gerald Hartman, but that identity only exists back to 2010. Before that, nothing. No birth certificate, no social security record, no military service. A ghost, Thomas murmured. A very wealthy ghost, Nathan corrected. Hartman has moved over $500 million through these operations. He's never been photographed, never given an interview. And according to our intel, he's coming to Denver next week. Thomas's pulse quickened. First time he's visited an operation personally? Yes, Nathan confirmed, which means something big is happening there. The Denver property cluster is their test case for a new model, accelerated acquisition protocol. If it works, they roll it out to 40 more cities. Thomas understood immediately. This wasn't about stopping one operation. It was about preventing a blueprint. I need to be in Denver, he said, tomorrow. Major Nathan replied carefully. This is bigger than Portland. Hartman will have security, legal protection, Federal law enforcement is building a RICO case, but it'll take months. Then we don't have months, Thomas said. If he's there personally, that's our window. I can get close, document everything, give you what you need to accelerate. You're talking about going undercover against someone who's evaded federal investigation for 15 years, Nathan said. Someone who clearly knows how to identify threats. Which is why he won't see me coming, Thomas replied, his voice carrying the quiet certainty that Maggie and Nathan had learned not to argue with. I'll be someone he'd never suspect. The line went silent for a moment. Then Nathan spoke again. What's the cover? Thomas glanced at Maggie. She was already pulling files from a secured cabinet. Documents, photographs, background materials for an identity they'd been developing as contingency. Eleanor Wright, Thomas said, 72 years old, widow, early-stage dementia, medical debt from her husband's cancer treatment, facing foreclosure on her apartment in veteran housing. Nathan's voice carried disbelief. Major, you're 68 years old. You're going to convince people you're a 72-year-old woman with dementia. I convinced the Riverside crew I was a crippled veteran, Thomas replied. This is just another mask. The difference is anatomy, Nathan said. Gender, voice, movement patterns. This isn't makeup and a limp. Thomas looked at Maggie. She nodded once. It's ambitious, she said, but we have resources, theatrical consultants, voice coaches. If anyone can do it, he can. And if you're wrong, Nathan pressed, if Hartman sees through it, then I disappear, Thomas said simply. But I don't think he will. Men like Hartman see what they expect. A confused elderly woman drowning in debt. That's invisible to them. That's beneath their notice. Until it's too late, Maggie added. The plan was insane, Thomas knew it. But he also knew something else. Hartman's appearance in Denver was unprecedented. That meant vulnerability. A man who hid behind layers of corporate structure for 15 years doesn't expose himself without reason. And whatever that reason was, Thomas intended to exploit it. I'll need 2 weeks to prepare, he said. Voice training, movement coaching, medical consultation on dementia presentation, full background documentation for Eleanor Wright. I'll arrange it, Maggie said. I know people in Los Angeles, theatrical specialists who work with intelligence agencies. They can make this work. Nathan's voice came through the line one more time. Major Grant, Thomas, I'm asking you to reconsider. This is the most dangerous operation you've attempted. No backup, no safety net. If Hartman discovers you, there's no extraction plan. Thomas closed his eyes briefly, seeing Sarah's face, remembering her voice, her insistence that one person could make a difference, that speaking truth to power mattered even when it cost everything. I know the risks, he said quietly, but there are 2,000 families who deserve justice, and 40 more cities full of people who don't know their targets yet. This is the only way to stop it. The line went silent again. Then Nathan spoke with resignation. All right, I'll coordinate with FBI Denver field office. They'll provide surveillance support. But Major, you need to promise me something. What? If you get the evidence we need, you get out immediately. No heroics, no extended engagement. Document and extract. Agreed, Thomas said. After the call ended, Maggie looked at him across the dim safe house. Her expression was unreadable. You know this is different, she said. Drake was regional, Hartman is national, maybe international. The people protecting him won't be local cops on the take. They'll be professionals. I know, Thomas replied, which is why Eleanor Wright needs to be perfect, not good. Perfect. Maggie stood and walked to the window, looking out at the Denver skyline visible in the distance. My son died because of people like Hartman, she said quietly. Contractors who cut corners, officials who looked the other way, a system that valued profit over lives. She turned back to him. So I'm with you, whatever it takes. But Thomas, she paused. After Denver, after Hartman, you need to think about what comes next. You can't do this forever. Thomas didn't answer, because he didn't have an answer. The mission had consumed him for 3 years. It had given him purpose when grief threatened to drown him. But Maggie was right. Eventually the mission would end, or it would end him. One thing at a time, he finally said. First, we stop Hartman. For the next 2 weeks, Thomas underwent the most intensive preparation of his career. The transformation into Eleanor Wright required more than costume and performance. It required fundamental changes to how he moved, spoke, and thought. The voice coach worked with him 8 hours a day, not just raising his pitch, but changing resonance patterns, breath control, the slight tremor that came with age, the way elderly women shape vowels differently than men. By day 10, he could maintain Eleanor's voice for 6 hours without break. By day 14, it was automatic. He stopped thinking about it. He simply became her. The movement specialist was equally demanding. Women carry their weight differently. Their centers of gravity sit lower. The way they gesture, the space they occupy. Thomas learned to make himself smaller, less imposing, to fold inward rather than expand outward. The dementia consultant was perhaps the most challenging. Early-stage cognitive decline wasn't about forgetting everything. It was about specific deficits, short-term memory loss, difficulty with word finding, moments of confusion followed by clarity. Too much, and people would question Eleanor's ability to live independently. Too little, and she wouldn't seem vulnerable enough to target. The performance required precision. On day 15, Thomas stood before a full-length mirror. Eleanor Wright stared back, gray wig styled in a practical shortcut, using makeup that added years without looking theatrical. Modest dress, sensible shoes, slight stoop to her shoulders. He spoke. Eleanor's voice emerged. "I'm not sure where I put my keys. Has anyone seen them?" Behind him, Maggie watched silently. After a moment, she nodded. "It's good," she said. "Very good. I've known you 3 years, and right now I'm looking at a stranger." Thomas turned, still maintaining Eleanor's posture. "The real test will be Hartman," he said, his voice returning to normal. "If he's survived this long, he knows how to read people. Then we make Eleanor so pathetic he doesn't bother reading her." Maggie replied, "She's not a threat. She's not even interesting. She's just another victim in a long line of victims." Thomas nodded slowly. "That's the key. Not just vulnerable, forgettable." 2 days later, Eleanor Wright moved into Riverside Terrace, a subsidized housing complex for veterans and their families on Denver's east side. The building was old but maintained, home to 40 residents, most over 65, many on fixed incomes. Within hours of Eleanor's arrival, Thomas understood why Mountain Ridge had targeted this location. The residents were exactly the profile Cascade exploited. Veterans with pride but limited resources, elderly couples, widows and widowers, people who'd worked their entire lives only to find themselves one medical emergency away from homelessness. His apartment was on the 3rd floor. One bedroom, small kitchen, view of the parking lot. Eleanor unpacked slowly, deliberately leaving things slightly disorganized. Mail piled on the counter, medications visible on the bathroom sink. The apartment of someone struggling to manage. That evening, there was a knock on the door. Thomas opened it to find an elderly Korean man standing in the hallway. Short, lean, military-bearing despite his age. "Welcome to the building," the man said, his accent slight but present. "I'm Harold Kim, 3rd floor. Been here 8 years, Eleanor Thomas replied, using her voice. "Eleanor Wright, I just moved in today." Harold's eyes were sharp despite his age. "You're a veteran's widow," Thomas said. "My husband served in Vietnam, died 6 months ago." Harold nodded slowly, respect in his expression. "This is a good building, good people. We look after each other." "That's comforting," Thomas replied. "I've been having trouble. Memory issues. My daughter thought I needed a place with support nearby." Harold's expression softened. "My wife had dementia before she passed," he said gently. "I understand. If you need anything, I'm in 312. After Harold left, Thomas sat in Eleanor's dim apartment, processing. Harold Kim wasn't just a resident, he was a protector, someone who'd taken responsibility for the community. That kind of man would notice if Mountain Ridge started pressuring people, which meant he was either already compromised or he was a target. Over the next week, Thomas as Eleanor integrated into Riverside Terrace. He met Rosa Martinez, 65 retired teacher and cancer survivor. James Whitmore, 70 former engineer with Parkinson's disease. Carol and Frank Bishop, both 74, married 52 years. Each one had a story. Each one had sacrificed. Each one was exactly the kind of person Cascade Holdings preyed upon. And as Thomas listened to their stories, something shifted inside him. This wasn't just an operation anymore. These were real people, his people, Veterans and families who'd served their country and deserved better than to be exploited by criminals in expensive suits. On day 8, Mountain Ridge made their first move. A woman named Victoria Lang arrived at Riverside Terrace, mid-40s, professional, carrying a leather portfolio and practiced smile. She called a community meeting in the building's common room. Thomas made sure Eleanor attended, sitting in the back, looking confused by the crowd. Victoria's presentation was polished. Mountain Ridge properties, structural concerns with the building, city code violations, estimated cost of repairs exceeding $8 million, buyout offers for residents, relocation assistance. The playbook was identical to Portland, just different words. Harold Kim stood during the question period, his voice respectful but firm. This building passed city inspection 6 months ago. What violations? Victoria smiled patiently. New standards, Mr. Kim. The city updated accessibility codes. Fire suppression requirements. These older buildings simply can't meet modern safety regulations. We have rights, Rosa Martinez said from her seat. You can't just force us out. Of course not, Victoria replied smoothly. This is entirely voluntary. But I'd encourage everyone to review the documentation carefully. The city will begin enforcement proceedings next month. Daily fines, potential condemnation. Property values will collapse once that starts. The fear in the room was palpable. Thomas watched faces, saw the confusion, the worry. These people had nowhere else to go, and Victoria knew it. After the meeting, Victoria approached Eleanor directly. Mr. Wright, she said, misgendering him by mistake but quickly correcting. I'm sorry, Mrs. Wright, Thomas played it perfectly. Eleanor's confusion. Yes, have we met? Victoria smiled warmly. I'm Victoria Lang. I wanted to make sure you understood the presentation. I know these things can be overwhelming. I'm not sure, Eleanor said, looking around vaguely. Was there a presentation? Victoria's eyes lit up. She'd found her perfect victim. Why don't we talk privately, she suggested. I can explain everything in simpler terms. That would be kind, Thomas replied. I do get confused sometimes. They moved to Eleanor's apartment. Victoria sat across from her, asking questions, probing financial situation, family support, medical conditions. Thomas answered each one perfectly, building Eleanor's profile. Isolated, impaired, desperate, and Victoria ate it up. This was exactly what she'd been trained to exploit. By the time she left, she had Eleanor scheduled for a private meeting with Mountain Ridge's senior representative, someone named Gerald Hartman. After Victoria departed, Thomas dropped the Eleanor persona, moved quickly to sweep the apartment for listening devices. Found 2, both planted while he was distracted during her visit. He left them active, let them hear what they expected. Eleanor making dinner, talking to herself, watching television at high volume, the sounds of someone alone and declining. But in his bedroom door closed, Thomas activated the secure line to Nathan. Hartman is coming, he said quietly. Personal meeting scheduled for next week. Victoria thinks I'm the perfect testimonial. Confused widow, grateful for their help. Nathan's voice was tense. Major, this is your chance to get out. We have enough to start building the case. You don't need to meet him face to face. Yes, I do, Thomas replied. Everything else is middlemen, financial trails, corporate records. We need Hartman on recording making direct statements. We need him to incriminate himself personally. He's not going to do that with a stranger, Nathan said, no matter how harmless she seems. He will if she's too confused to understand what she's hearing, Thomas countered. That's Eleanor's advantage. She's beneath suspicion because she's beneath comprehension. The line went silent. Thomas could almost hear Nathan weighing the risks against the potential gain. Finally, Nathan spoke. All right, but we're putting surveillance on that meeting, audio and visual. And Major, the second you get what we need, you signal and we extract you. Understood. Understood, Thomas confirmed. But even as he said it, he knew that extraction might not be simple because something about this operation felt different. Hartman coming to Denver personally, the accelerated timeline, the new model they were testing. Whatever was happening here, it was bigger than real estate fraud. And Thomas had the growing certainty that meeting Gerald Hartman face-to-face might reveal something neither he nor the FBI had anticipated. In Riverside Heights, he'd been hunting small predators. In Denver, he was about to confront the apex. And for the first time in 3 years, Thomas Grant felt something he'd almost forgotten. Not fear exactly, but respect for his opponent. Hartman had evaded federal law enforcement for 15 years, had built an empire in exploiting the vulnerable, had left thousands of victims without ever exposing himself to risk. Until now. The question was why? What made Denver worth the risk? What was Hartman really after? Thomas intended to find out. Even if it meant walking directly into the lion's den, wearing the disguise of a confused 72-year-old widow who couldn't remember where she'd left her keys. Because predators who grew comfortable in shadows could never resist the perfect victim. And Eleanor Wright was about to become the most perfect victim Gerald Hartman had ever seen. Right up until the moment she wasn't. The meeting was set for Tuesday afternoon at Mountain Ridge Properties' downtown offices. Victoria had called personally to confirm. Mr. Hartman is looking forward to meeting you, Mrs. Wright. He rarely takes personal meetings with residents. You should feel honored. Thomas had smiled Eleanor's confused smile into the phone. That's very kind. What time should I be there again? 2 o'clock, Victoria had replied patiently. I'll send a car to pick you up. We wouldn't want you to get lost. The condescension was perfect. They saw Eleanor exactly as Thomas needed them to. Helpless, forgettable, harmless. On Tuesday morning, Thomas went through Eleanor's preparation ritual with meticulous care. The aging makeup applied in layers. Each wrinkle placed precisely. The wig positioned and secured. Clothing selected for maximum effect. Modest dress, comfortable shoes, a handbag containing tissues, reading glasses, and pill bottles. Hidden within the reading glasses was a fiber optic camera. The pill bottles contained backup recording devices, and sewn into the lining of the handbag was an emergency beacon that would alert Nathan with a single press. Maggie watched from the doorway of the safe house. You look like my grandmother, she said quietly. That's the idea, Thomas replied in Eleanor's voice. He turned slowly, checking the mirror one final time. What do you see? An old woman who's struggling? Maggie answered. Someone who needs help. Someone who'd be grateful for any kindness. Good, Thomas said. That's exactly what Hartman needs to see. The car arrived at 1:30, a black sedan driven by a young man who introduced himself as Michael. He helped Eleanor into the back seat with exaggerated care, as if she might break. During the 20-minute drive downtown, Thomas remained in character, looking out the window with vague interest, asking Michael questions that revealed Eleanor's confusion. Is this the way to the doctor? I thought I had an appointment. No, ma'am, Michael replied patiently. Mr. Hartman's office. Remember Victoria arranged the meeting. Oh, yes, Eleanor said. Mr. Hartman, he's going to help me with the building. That's right, ma'am. The Mountain Ridge offices occupied the 15th floor of a glass tower in Denver's financial district. The lobby was all marble and chrome, designed to intimidate, to remind visitors of the power differential. Victoria met them at reception, smiling warmly, taking Eleanor's arm. You made it, she said brightly. How are you feeling today? A little tired, Thomas replied in Eleanor's trembling voice. I didn't sleep well. I kept worrying about the building, about where I'd go. That's exactly why we're here, Victoria soothed. Mr. Hartman is going to explain everything. You'll feel so much better afterward. She guided Eleanor through security, past conference rooms where young professionals worked at computers, past offices with views of the city, finally to a corner suite with double doors. Victoria knocked once, then opened the door. Mr. Hartman, Eleanor Wright is here. Thomas stepped into the office, and for the first time he saw Gerald Hartman in person. The man was tall, late 50s, well-built beneath an expensive suit. His hair was silver at the temples, his face weathered but strong. But it was his eyes that Thomas noticed first. Sharp, calculating. Eyes that had seen things, done things, military eyes. Mrs. Wright Hartman said, rising from behind a massive desk. His voice was smooth, but carried undertones of command. Thank you for coming. Please sit. He gestured to a chair facing the desk. Thomas moved slowly, Eleanor's careful shuffle, lowering herself into the seat with visible effort. Hartman waited until Victoria left, closing the doors behind her. Then he sat, studying Eleanor with those sharp eyes. For a moment, Thomas wondered if the disguise would hold, if Hartman would see through the makeup and performance to the threat beneath. But then Hartman smiled, the expression warm but practiced. "Victoria tells me you've lived at Riverside Terrace for 6 months," he said. "Yes," Thomas replied, Eleanor's voice uncertain. "Since my husband died. He was a veteran. Vietnam." Hartman nodded slowly. "My father was military," he said. "I have great respect for those who serve." The lie came easily to him. Thomas made note of it. Everything about Hartman was performance, calculated to put Eleanor at ease while extracting information. "I understand you're having some concerns about the building situation," Hartman continued. "I don't really understand it," Eleanor said, looking down at her hands. "They said something about violations, about having to leave, but I just moved in. Where would I go?" "That's exactly what I wanted to discuss," Hartman replied. He leaned forward slightly, the gesture appearing sympathetic. "Mrs. Wright, the truth is that Riverside Terrace has significant structural problems. The city is requiring expensive repairs, repairs that the current ownership cannot afford." He paused, letting that sink in. "We at Mountain Ridge specialize in helping residents in situations like yours. We can offer you a fair price for your apartment, handle all the logistics of relocation, make this transition as smooth as possible." Thomas let Eleanor's confusion show on her face. "But I don't own the apartment. I rent." Hartman's expression didn't change, but Thomas saw the flicker, the realization that Victoria had made an error in her assessment. For a moment, Hartman reconsidered whether this meeting was worth his time. Then Thomas played his card. "But my husband's life insurance," Eleanor said hesitantly. "I have some money. The building manager said I could buy my unit, that it would be a good investment." Hartman's interest returned. "How much?" "200,000, Thomas replied, "from the insurance. I was going to use it to buy the apartment, to have security." Hartman leaned back, his mind clearly calculating. "That changes things," he said smoothly. "If you own your unit, then yes, we can definitely work with you. In fact, I think we can structure this in a way that benefits you significantly." He stood, walking to a wall covered with maps. Thomas recognized them immediately. Denver properties, blue pins for current holdings, red pins for targets. Riverside Terrace was marked with a red pin. "This entire district is being redeveloped," Hartman explained, his voice taking on the tone of someone sharing inside information. "In 5 years, property values here will triple, maybe quadruple." He turned back to Eleanor. "If you invest your insurance money in buying your unit, you could see significant returns. We're offering special financing terms to residents who want to participate in the ownership transition." Thomas understood the play immediately. Get Eleanor to invest her life insurance money, then pressure her to sell at a loss when the building faced condemnation. It was more sophisticated than simple intimidation. It was structured theft. "I'm not sure I understand," Eleanor said, fumbling in her handbag. "Do you have something written down? I have trouble remembering things." "Of course," Hartman replied. He pulled a folder from his desk, thick with documents. "This outlines everything: the purchase agreement, the financing terms, the projected returns." He placed it in front of Eleanor, taking his time, explaining each section with patient condescension, exactly like a predator might with prey that couldn't escape. And Thomas recorded every word, every document, every lie. But something else was happening too. As Hartman talked, Thomas noticed details. The military bearing Hartman couldn't quite hide. The way he stood, the terminology he used, the scar on his left hand that looked like a training injury. This man had been military, recently enough that the habits remained. During a pause in Hartman's presentation, Thomas took a risk, Eleanor asking a confused question that would reveal more. "My husband used to say something about men like you," Eleanor said, looking up at Hartman with vague eyes. "What was it?" "Something about officers, about planning." Hartman's expression shifted, just slightly. "Officers?" "Yes," Eleanor continued. "He said you could always tell military officers, even years later, something about how they stand, how they organize things." Thomas watched Hartman's micro-expressions, the flash of surprise, the recalibration. the awareness that Eleanor had noticed something she shouldn't have been capable of noticing. Your husband was perceptive, Hartman said carefully. Were you military yourself, Mrs. Wright? Oh, no, Eleanor replied quickly. Just a teacher, but I lived on base with him. You pick up things. Thomas had pushed too far. He could see Hartman's mind working now, questioning whether Eleanor was as confused as she appeared, whether this meeting was what it seemed. Victoria knocked and entered. Mr. Hartman, your 3 o'clock is here. Perfect timing. Hartman's expression smoothed. He turned back to Eleanor with renewed smile. Mrs. Wright, why don't you take these documents home? Review them. We can meet again next week to finalize everything. That's very kind, Thomas said, standing slowly, using Eleanor's careful movements. I appreciate your time. As Victoria escorted Eleanor toward the door, Hartman spoke again. Mrs. Wright, one more thing. Thomas turned. Yes. How did you really hear about Riverside Terrace? Hartman asked, his voice casual but his eyes sharp. It's not easy to get into. There's usually a waiting list. The question was a test. Thomas felt the weight of it. One wrong answer, and Hartman would investigate. Would discover Eleanor Wright's background was fabricated. Would realize the trap. My daughter, Thomas replied, Eleanor's confusion returning. She works for the VA. She said there was an opening. That I needed to take it before someone else did. The answer was plausible. Boring enough to be true. Hartman studied Eleanor for a moment longer, then nodded. Give my regards to your daughter, he said. Outside the building, Thomas maintained Eleanor's persona until the car dropped him at Riverside Terrace. He shuffled to his apartment, aware that they might be watching. Once inside, he waited a full hour before allowing the disguise to drop. Then he activated the secure line to Nathan. I've got him, Thomas said quietly. Full recording, he laid out the entire scheme. Document fraud, false projections, financial exploitation of vulnerable residents. Nathan's voice crackled through. That's good work, Major. But did he incriminate himself personally? Thomas confirmed. Multiple direct statements tying him to Mountain Ridge operations. More than enough to establish knowledge and intent. Then we move, Nathan said. FBI is preparing warrants now. We'll hit Mountain Ridge offices tomorrow morning. Seize documents, arrest Hartman and his entire operation. Thomas should have felt satisfaction. The mission was complete, evidence secured, justice incoming. But something nagged at him. Something about Hartman's final question. The way he'd looked at Eleanor. Nathan, Thomas said slowly, I think Hartman suspects something. What makes you say that? The questions about how I got into Riverside Terrace. The way he studied me at the end. He's going to run a background check on Eleanor Wright, and he'll find a valid identity, Nathan replied. We built Eleanor's background carefully. Birth certificate, social security, rental history. It'll hold up to scrutiny. Thomas wasn't convinced. Men like Hartman don't survive 15 years by trusting surface details. He'll dig deeper, and when he does, he'll find inconsistencies. Then we move faster, Nathan said. Warrants are approved. We go in at 0600 tomorrow. Hartman will be in custody before he can act on any suspicions. Thomas agreed to the timeline, but after disconnecting, he sat in Eleanor's dim apartment feeling the weight of concern. Hartman was different from Marcus Stone, different from Drake. This was someone who'd operated at a level Thomas was only beginning to understand. And men at that level didn't expose themselves without contingencies. That night, Thomas barely slept. He reviewed the recording a dozen times, analyzing every word, every gesture, building the prosecution case in his mind. By morning, he was certain they had enough. At 5:30 a.m., Thomas's secure phone vibrated. Nathan's voice was tense. Major, we've got a problem. What happened? Hartman's gone. Private jet left Denver International at 0300. Destination unknown. Thomas was already moving, stripping off Eleanor's wig, reaching for tactical gear. How did he know? We're checking now, Nathan replied. But Major, there's more. Hartman didn't just run. He's activated some kind of contingency. Victoria Lang is dead, apparent suicide. 2 other Mountain Ridge employees are missing. He's cleaning house, Thomas said, eliminating anyone who could testify against him. That's our assessment, Nathan confirmed. FBI is coordinating with FAA. We're tracking the jet. But if he reaches international airspace, jurisdiction gets complicated. Thomas's mind raced. Hartman had known. Somehow he'd realized Eleanor was a threat. Maybe not the specifics, but enough to trigger his escape protocol. Nathan Thomas said. Where's the jet heading southwest trajectory? Nathan replied. Possibly Mexico, possibly further. We've got Coast Guards scrambling helicopters to intercept before he reaches the border. Thomas made a decision. I'm coming with you, Major. This is a federal operation. You're a civilian consultant who happens to have 2,000 flight hours and combat experience in aircraft interdiction, Thomas countered. You need someone who can coordinate tactical response. I can do that. There was a pause. Then Nathan spoke with resignation. Coast Guard staging area is at Buckley Air Force Base. Be there in 20 minutes. Thomas grabbed his go bag, the one he'd kept packed since Portland. Tactical vest, communications gear. Sidearm he was licensed to carry. As he moved through the safe house, Maggie appeared in the doorway. He's running, she said. It wasn't a question. Thomas nodded. I'm going after him. Maggie's expression was conflicted. 3 years you've been doing this. 7 operations. You've never failed. Maybe that's enough. Maybe you let the FBI handle Hartman. Thomas paused at the door, meeting her eyes. If I let him go, he'll rebuild somewhere else. Under a new name, new identity, and 2,000 victims will watch their predator escape. He shook his head. I can't let that happen. Maggie stepped forward, pulling him into a brief embrace. Then bring him back. And then, Thomas, you need to stop. Before this work takes everything from you. I know, Thomas replied quietly. After this one, I'm done. The Coast Guard helicopter was a MH-60 Jayhawk, fast, maneuverable, equipped for search and rescue but capable of pursuit operations. Thomas strapped in next to Nathan and 3 FBI tactical agents. The pilot was a woman in her 30s, Lieutenant Sarah Chen. She gave Thomas a quick assessment. You're the consultant, retired Marine Major, Thomas replied. 2,000 hours flight time. Combat operations in the Gulf. Chen nodded. Good enough. We've got tracking on the target aircraft. Cessna citation, currently over northern New Mexico, heading for the Mexican border at max speed. ETA to international airspace, Nathan asked. 45 minutes, Chen replied. We can intercept in 20. The helicopter lifted off, the vibration familiar to Thomas after years in military aircraft. As they flew south, Nathan briefed him on the situation. Hartman's pilot filed a flight plan for El Paso, Chen explained. But they're not following it. Current trajectory puts them over the border south of Juarez. Thomas studied the tactical display. Once he's in Mexican airspace, it gets complicated, he said. We can't force him down without international incident. That's why we need to stop him before the border. Nathan replied, FAA has authorized us to order him to land. If he refuses, we're cleared to disable the aircraft. Disable how? Thomas asked. Chen answered. We have F-16 scrambling from Holloman Air Force Base. They can force him down non-lethally. Warning shots. Escort to the nearest airfield. And if he still refuses, then it becomes a question of how badly we want him, Chen said. Because shooting down a civilian aircraft, even one fleeing prosecution, requires authorization from very high up. The helicopter pushed south at maximum speed. Below them, the landscape transformed. From Denver's urban sprawl to the high plains, then to the rugged terrain of northern New Mexico. Thomas's radio crackled. Target in visual range. Through the helicopter's window, Thomas spotted the Cessna citation, white with blue striping, flying low and fast. Clearly trying to minimize radar signature, Chen maneuvered the Jayhawk into pursuit position. Her voice was calm but commanding on the radio. Citation November 7-2 Charlie. This is United States Coast Guard. You are ordered to return to Denver International Airport immediately. For a moment there was silence. Then a voice responded. Smooth, controlled. Thomas recognized it immediately. Gerald Hartman, Coast Guard. This is November 7-2. Charlie, I'm experiencing radio difficulties. Request vectors to nearest airport for emergency landing. The lie was smooth, buying time. Chen glanced at Nathan. He's stalling. Nathan keyed his radio. Hartman, this is FBI Special Agent Nathan Cross. We know who you are. We know where you're going. Land the aircraft now or we will force you down. Another pause. Then Hartman's voice again. Harder now. You think you've won, don't you? Cross you and that old widow who wasn't a widow. Thomas felt ice in his veins. Hartman knew. Had known all along. I figured it out last night, Hartman continued, his voice almost conversational despite the circumstances. Eleanor Wright. Too convenient. Too perfectly vulnerable. I had my people dig into Eleanor Wright's background. Social Security number only goes back 5 years. No birth certificate before 2018. Your identity was fabricated. So I cross-referenced the creation date with FBI consultant databases. You know what I found? A psychological operations specialist named Thomas Grant, who's been dismantling criminal networks for 3 years. Thomas's jaw tightened. Major Thomas Grant, Hartman said, retired Marine, counterintelligence specialist, psychological operations, very impressive resume. 7 operations before mine. Portland was particularly well executed. Nathan shot Thomas a look. Thomas's expression was stone. So here's what's going to happen, Hartman continued. I'm going to land this aircraft in Mexico. You're going to let me. Because if you don't, I'll release documentation that exposes every illegal operation Grant has run for the past 3 years. Wiretapping without warrants, identity fraud, entrapment. Every case he's touched will fall apart in appeals court. It was a bluff. It had to be. But Nathan's expression showed concern. Hartman had clearly researched Thomas's methods. Knew enough to make the threat credible. You're bluffing, Nathan said into the radio. Am I? Hartman replied. Grant's Portland operation, Marcus Stone. How much of that evidence was obtained legally? Because from what I can tell, Stone's arrest was based on recordings made by a civilian conducting an unauthorized investigation. Thomas keyed his own radio. This is Grant, he said, his voice carrying the command authority of his military years. You're right about my methods, Hartman, but you're wrong about the result. Every case I've touched has been prosecuted successfully because I made sure the evidence was admissible. I don't entrap, I document. Hartman laughed. It was a cold sound. You're a vigilante with a military pedigree, Grant. Nothing more, and vigilantes always fall eventually. Then why are you running, Thomas asked. If my evidence won't hold up, why not stay and fight it in court? Silence on the line. Thomas had struck a nerve. Because you know it will hold, Thomas continued. You know I was careful. And you know that once I testify, once those recordings are played for a jury, your empire collapses. More silence. Then Hartman's voice returned, colder. You should have stayed retired, Major. You've already won in Portland. Coming after me was a mistake you'll regret. Instead, you started a war you can't win. Thomas felt rage building, but he controlled it, channeled it. This is what you do, isn't it, Hartman run, when things get difficult? Hide behind shell companies and offshore accounts. But you can't hide forever. Watch me, Hartman replied. Then the Cessna citation accelerated. Full throttle, racing for the border. Chen pushed the helicopter to match speed, but the jet was faster. The gap widened. He's going to make it, she said. 2 minutes to Mexican airspace. Nathan was on the radio to command, requesting authorization for forcible interdiction. Thomas watched the Cessna pull away, watched 15 years of predation about to escape justice, watched 2,000 victims about to see their tormentor vanish. Then the radio crackled again. Different voice. Military precision. Citation, November 7-2, Charlie. This is Angel 1 and 2, United States Air Force. You are ordered to descend immediately to flight level 10,000. Thomas looked up. 2 F-16 Fighting Falcons appeared from cloud cover. Sleek, deadly, flanking the Cessna on both sides. Land your aircraft now, the F-16 pilot continued, or we will disable your engines. Hartman's voice came back, tight with barely controlled panic. You wouldn't dare. I'm a civilian aircraft. You have no authority. We have presidential authorization, the pilot replied. Land now or be forced down. For 10 seconds, nothing happened. The Cessna continued south. The F-16S matched its course. The border grew closer. Then Thomas saw it. The Cessna's landing gear deploying, the aircraft beginning to descend. He's landing, Chen said, relief in her voice. Below them, a small regional airport appeared, barely more than a single runway. The Cessna touched down hard, too fast. Brakes screaming, it skidded to a stop just before the runway ended. FBI ground units were already moving, vehicles racing across the tarmac. Within minutes, they had the aircraft surrounded, agents with weapons drawn, orders being shouted through megaphones. The Cessna's door opened. Gerald Hartman emerged, hands raised. But his expression wasn't defeat. It was calculation. Even in surrender, he was planning. The helicopter landed 50 yards away. Thomas was the first out. Walking toward Hartman as FBI agents cuffed him. Nathan close behind. Hartman saw Thomas approaching. His eyes narrowed, then widened slightly in recognition. Not Eleanor anymore. Just Thomas. Military bearing. No disguise, Major Grant Hartman said. Even handcuffed, his voice carried arrogance. We finally meet properly. Thomas stopped 3 feet away, looking at the man who'd built an empire on suffering, who'd destroyed families, who'd evaded justice for 15 years. Gerald Hutchinson, Thomas said quietly, former Army captain, dishonorably discharged in 1998 for selling classified intelligence. You've been hiding for a long time. Hardiman's expression flickered. How did you... I was part of the investigation that ended your military career. Thomas replied, I never forget a face, even when you changed the name. Recognition dawned in Hartman's eyes. You were the counterintelligence officer, the one who built the case. Thomas nodded. And now I've built another one. Only this time you won't just lose your career. You'll lose your freedom. Hartman's smugness cracked. You think this is over? I have lawyers, resources. I'll fight this for years. You can try, Thomas said, but I've got recordings of you personally directing fraud, financial exploitation, conspiracy, and once the other victims come forward, once they testify about what you did to them, no lawyer will save you. Nathan stepped forward. Gerald Hutchinson, also known as Gerald Hartman. You're under arrest for racketeering, fraud, conspiracy to commit murder, and about 40 other charges were still tallying. As agents led Hartman toward a waiting vehicle, he turned back one more time, looking at Thomas with something almost like respect. You're good, Grant, he said. Better than I expected. But this life you're living, it'll consume you eventually, just like it consumed me. Thomas didn't reply, because part of him knew Hartman was right. The mission had consumed him. For 3 years, he'd lived in disguises, hunting predators, becoming what he hunted in order to stop them. But that ended today. 6 months later, Thomas stood in a federal courtroom in Denver, watching as the judge read the verdict. On all counts, the jury finds the defendant guilty. Gerald Hutchinson, formerly Hartman, showed no emotion, but his shoulders sagged slightly, the weight of justice finally landing after years of evasion. The sentencing came 2 weeks later, 50 years federal prison. Hutchinson was 58. It was effectively a life sentence. Thomas didn't attend the sentencing. He'd already said goodbye to this case, to this mission. Instead, he was in Virginia, at FBI headquarters in Quantico, beginning a new chapter. The training facility was familiar. He'd taught here decades ago as a young Marine captain. Now he was back, but not as a soldier, as something else. Director Hayes met him in a conference room overlooking the academy grounds. Major Grant, she said. Welcome back to Quantico. Thank you, Director Thomas replied. Hayes was direct. No pretense. Your work over the past 3 years has been remarkable, she said. Unconventional, sometimes legally questionable, but undeniably effective. 7 major criminal organizations dismantled. Over 2,000 victims given justice. She paused. We want you to help us replicate that effectiveness within legal boundaries, training our agents in psychological operations, behavioral analysis, undercover tactics. Thomas had known this was coming. Nathan had been pushing for it for months. And after Denver, after coming so close to crossing lines he couldn't uncross, Thomas knew it was time. I'm honored, he said, but I have conditions. Morrison smiled slightly. I expected you would. I choose which cases to consult on, Thomas said. I won't work investigations targeting vulnerable populations unless there's clear predation. And I maintain right of refusal, agreed, Morrison replied. What else? I want to develop a specialized training program, Thomas continued, teaching agents how to identify and infiltrate operations that exploit the elderly, disabled, and veteran communities. These victims are often invisible to traditional law enforcement. We need people who can see them. Morrison nodded slowly. That's ambitious. But given your track record, I think we can make it happen. They discussed details for another hour. Salary, title, resources. By the end, Thomas had official federal employment for the first time in his life. Consultant was the formal title, but really he was something else. The person who'd learned to hunt predators by becoming their perfect victim. After the meeting, Thomas walked the Quantico grounds, remembering his younger self, the Marine officer who'd believed in clear chains of command, in rules of engagement, in the system. That man was gone, but what replaced him was something more useful. Someone who understood that justice sometimes required operating in spaces the system couldn't reach. He just wouldn't have to do it alone anymore. 3 months into his Quantico position, Thomas received a call from Nathan. "Major, you need to see this." Thomas drove to Riverside Heights, back to the neighborhood where this had all started. The Victorian on Ashford Lane stood unchanged, but the residents had organized a community event, celebrating the anniversary of Drake's conviction. Thomas arrived quietly, not wanting attention. But an elderly woman spotted him immediately. "Major Grant," she called out. "Come, join us." Thomas tried to demur, but the residents insisted. They wanted to thank him, to show him what his sacrifice had meant. Margaret Chen, whose husband had nearly lost their home to the Riverside crew, had tears in her eyes as she hugged him. "You saved our neighborhood," she said. "Our community. We can never repay that." Old Mr. Patterson, who had lived on Ashford Lane for 50 years, shook Thomas's hand with trembling fingers. "My grandchildren can visit me here now," he said, "in the home I've known my whole life, because of you." The gratitude was overwhelming. Thomas had spent 3 years focused on the mission, on justice. He'd never fully processed the human impact. These weren't just case files. They were lives, families, communities, and he'd helped preserve them. As the celebration continued, a young man approached, late 20s, military haircut, wearing a jacket that said Iraq veteran. "Major Grant," he asked. "I'm Jake Morrison." Thomas shook his hand. "Good to meet you, Jake." Jake hesitated, then spoke quickly. "I heard what you did, taking down Drake and the Riverside crew. I've been struggling since I got back from deployment, trying to find purpose, and I was wondering if you might need help. With whatever you're doing now." Thomas studied him, seeing himself 40 years ago, a young veteran looking for meaning, for a way to serve that mattered. "What makes you think I need help?" Thomas asked. Jake smiled slightly. "Because guys like us always do. We can't stop serving. We just need to find the right mission." Thomas considered, then pulled a business card from his pocket. FBI Behavioral Analysis Unit, Quantico, Virginia. His name and number printed below the seal. "I'm developing a training program," Thomas said, "teaching agents how to protect vulnerable populations from predation. It's not combat, but it's important work. Lives depend on it." He handed Jake the card. "If you're interested, call me next week. We'll talk about what you can bring to the mission." Jake took the card with something like reverence. "Thank you, sir. I will." As Jake walked away, Thomas felt something shift inside him. For 3 years, he'd been a lone operator, hunting justice in the shadows. But maybe that wasn't sustainable. Maybe the real mission was building something that would outlast him, teaching others, passing on the knowledge, creating a generation of protectors who could see what the system missed. That evening, Thomas returned to his home in Virginia, a small house near Quantico. Modest, quiet. The walls held few decorations. A photo of Sarah on the mantel, his Marine medals in a shadow box, a few books. But on his desk was something new. A letter from Marcus Stone, still in prison but eligible for parole in 6 years. Thomas had testified at his sentencing hearing, recommending rehabilitation programs for Stone's cooperation in exposing Drake. The letter was brief, not quite gratitude, but acknowledgement. "My daughter visited last week," Marcus had written. "First time in 4 years. She said if I can change, she'll give me another chance. I don't know if I can, but I'm trying. That started when you showed me there was no escape from the truth." Thomas folded the letter carefully, placing it in a drawer with others from victims, from people whose lives had changed because of operations that had nearly destroyed him. This was the legacy, not the arrests, not the convictions, but the lives rebuilt, the families preserved, the predators stopped before they could create more victims. His phone rang. Nathan's number. Thomas answered. "Cross," he said, using Nathan's last name as he always did in casual conversation. Major Nathan replied, "Just got word. The last of Hutchinson's network was arrested today. Phoenix, Seattle, Boston. 42 operations shut down simultaneously. Over 300 arrests. Thomas absorbed this. The full scope of what they had accomplished. How many victims, he asked. Conservative estimate, Nathan replied. 2,500, maybe more. Financial restitution is already starting. Properties being returned. Lives being rebuilt. 2,500 families, Thomas thought. 2,500 chances for justice that wouldn't have happened without the mission. Good work, he said quietly. Your work, Major Nathan corrected. You started this. We just finished it. After the call ended, Thomas sat in the quiet of his home, feeling the weight of 3 years lifting. The mission that had consumed him was complete. Drake in prison, Hutchinson in prison, their networks dismantled, victims vindicated, and somehow impossibly he'd survived. Not physically. He'd never been in real danger of death, but he'd survived the danger of becoming what he hunted, of losing himself in the disguises and deceptions. He opened his desk drawer, pulled out the silver locket containing Sarah's photo, looked at her face, her smile. I kept my promise, he whispered. Justice for you, and for everyone they heard after. He could almost hear her voice, proud but concerned, reminding him that vengeance wasn't victory, that the real win was in the living, in the helping, in the building of something that lasted. And for the first time in 3 years, Thomas believed he could do that, could be more than the hunter, could become the mentor, the teacher, the one who ensured others could fight battles he no longer needed to fight alone. The next morning, Thomas arrived at Quantico early. His first class of trainees was waiting. 12 FBI agents, young, eager, ready to learn. He stood before them in the lecture hall. No uniform now, just civilian clothes. But his bearing was still military, still commanding. My name is Thomas Grant, he began, and I'm going to teach you how to see the invisible. He clicked to the first slide. Images of victims, elderly, disabled, veterans, the populations that predators targeted because society overlooked them. These people are invisible to most law enforcement, Thomas said. Too old, too impaired, too unimportant. Predators know this, and they exploit it. He clicked again. Crime statistics. Financial fraud targeting seniors. Property theft, medical scams. But you're going to learn to see them, Thomas continued, to understand how predators think, how they select victims, how they operate, and most importantly, how to stop them. Over the next 3 months, Thomas taught his trainees everything he'd learned, the psychology of predation, the patterns of exploitation, the art of undercover work. But he also taught them the bond and the toll such work took, the danger of losing yourself in the mission. On the final day of training, he gave them his last lesson, standing before the class in the same lecture hall where he'd started. You're about to go into the field, he said. You'll face criminals who are smarter, better funded, and more ruthless than you can imagine. You'll see victims who've lost everything, who've given up hope. He paused, looking at each face. Your job is to give them hope back, to be the justice they've been denied. But never forget who you are in the process. Never become what you hunt. One trainee raised her hand, Agent Michelle Chen, daughter of the helicopter pilot who'd helped capture Hutchinson. How do we avoid that, sir? How do we stay human while hunting monsters? Thomas smiled slightly. You remember why you started, you hold on to the people you're protecting, and you never work alone. The moment you start operating solo thinking you're the only one who can get justice, that's when you lose yourself. He thought of his own 3 years, the isolation, the obsession, how close he'd come to crossing lines that couldn't be uncrossed. Trust your team, he said. Trust the system even when it fails. And most importantly, trust yourself to know when it's time to stop. After class ended, Agent Chen approached. My mother told me about you, she said. About what you did, how you helped stop Hutchinson. Thomas nodded. She's a good pilot. We were lucky to have her. She also said you almost got yourself killed going after him. Chen continued, that you were willing to sacrifice everything for the mission. Thomas considered his response carefully. I was, he admitted, but that wasn't strength. It was obsession. The real strength is knowing when the mission ends and life begins again. Chen studied him. Have you found that line yet? Thomas looked out the window at the Quantico grounds, at the trainees preparing for their own missions, at the future he was helping build. I'm learning, he said. 6 months after completing his first training cycle, Thomas received a letter. No return address, postmarked from Seattle. Inside was a single photograph. Jake Morrison in FBI tactical gear, standing with a team at what looked like a crime scene. On the back, Jake had written, "First operation successful. Took down an elder fraud ring in Tacoma. 15 victims recovered their savings. Thank you for showing me this path." Thomas placed the photo on his desk next to Sarah's. Two images, one of the past, one of the future. This was the legacy, not his operations, not his arrests, but the people he'd trained, the lives they'd touch, the justice they'd bring to those who'd been forgotten. That evening, Thomas sat in his study, reading case files for his next training cycle. The work continued, it always would, but now it continued through others, through agents who'd carry the mission forward long after he was gone. His phone buzzed, text message from Maggie. She'd stayed in touch, checking on him regularly, making sure he was actually living instead of just existing. The message was simple. Dinner this weekend, real food, real conversation, no missions, just life. Thomas smiled, typed back a single word. Yes. For 3 years, he'd been Thomas Grant the hunter, the vigilante, the weapon pointed at predators who thought themselves untouchable. But that weapon was being retired, put away, not destroyed, just stored, because the hunt was over. The mission complete. What remained was the man, the teacher, the mentor, the one who'd learned that justice wasn't a solo crusade. It was a collective effort, a system that worked when good people stood in the right places and refused to look away. Thomas closed his laptop, turned off the desk lamp. Tomorrow would bring new trainees, new lessons, new chances to build something that lasted. But tonight he'd rest, because for the first time in 3 years he could. The predators he'd hunted were caged. The victims he'd fought for were safe, and the legacy he'd leave would protect countless more. In Riverside Heights, where it all began, the Victorian on Ashford Lane stood quiet under autumn stars. No limping veteran walked its halls. No surveillance captured shadows. Just an empty home, a monument to a mission completed. But in Quantico and lecture halls and training facilities, Thomas Grant's real work continued. Not in disguise, not in shadow, but in light, teaching others to be the guardians the vulnerable needed, the protectors the system overlooked. And somewhere in memory and spirit, Sarah Grant smiled, because her husband had found his way back, not to who he was before, but to who he was always meant to become. A warrior who'd learned that the strongest battles weren't fought with weapons. They were fought with wisdom, with patience, with the courage to become vulnerable in order to protect the truly vulnerable. That was the lesson. That was the legacy. And that was the Silent Guardian's final mission. Not to hunt alone, but to teach others to hunt together. To build a network of protectors who would stand where darkness gathered and say with absolute certainty, not here, not anymore, not while we watch. The predators would always exist, but so would the guardians. And as long as people like Thomas Grant trained people like Jake Morrison and Sarah Chen, the balance would hold. But justice would prevail, not because it was easy, but because someone chose to make it possible. And that someone no longer walked alone.